Hello, everyone. Um, Thank you for being patient for today's lecture. I want to start by apologizing that the lecture comes up a little later today. As I told you on the messages I've sent you before the weekend, I've been dealing with a bit of a COVID situation in my house. So everything takes a little bit more time. So I'd like to apologize. Everybody is feeling fine, so I'm fine about that. But it just means that things are being delayed a little bit more than I was hoping. The lecture, let me put the slides on the screen. There you go. A few things before I begin. So everything's okay in terms of COVID. We're getting better over time, and I hope that we're not going to have any more delays with the rest of the material for you this week. So that's one thing. Number two, later tonight, Monday, I will send you a link to the first quiz. So what you do is you're going to have to click that link, just follow the instructions, and make sure that you answer the questions based on the instructions. This is quiz for the reading material, not for this week, but for next week. So you have until the deadline, as it's stated on your syllabus, is next Sunday night. So on Sunday night, right after the Super Bowl ends, that's going to be the deadline to send me that. Just click on the link, get in, and in this link, you will have access to answer a bunch of questions related to the readings for next week, week 4. So if you have any questions about that, of course, there's office hours during the week, and there's emails as always. And that's going to lead me to the third point, because I'm still dealing with this COVID and quarantine situation in my house. I'm not going to have class on this Friday as well, unfortunately. So I will not see you this Friday as well. Hopefully by next Friday, we'll be able to begin this face-to-face part of the lecture, and we should be fine. So if you have any questions, of course, office hours, email, just talk to me, and I can try and help you as much as possible. One last thing, the background behind me, I'm not sure how much you can see, is Company D1 at the Texas A&M Course of Cadets. Thank you for Mr. Kia and Jesse for sending me that picture. And if you want your company or your pet or your background in one of the future lectures, then of course you can send that to me as well. Okay, so that's all kinds of the technical things before I begin. And now I want to move ahead and start talking about today's topic. As always, we begin with a quick review of Thursday, of last week's Wednesday's meeting. So I completed the discussion about the construction of theories by talking about the levels of analysis when we're studying international relations. The main point in that concept relate to the fact that we can study the same phenomena or the same event from multiple angles. We can think about that from the macro level, which is looking at the event from the international system level. So the war was, we can explore a certain war or a certain negotiation between countries or a certain agreement signed between countries based on different conditions that take place within the international system itself. So relationship between countries or any kind of a structural factor that affects that. At the same time, we can also look at the same war, at the same negotiation, and the same signing of an agreement from the micro level of analysis, which is focusing on the nation state themselves, looking at the internal dynamics, the internal structure of the state, whether there are, some of them were democracies, some of them were non-democracies. Even within democracies, we can look even into that by thinking about, there's democracies which are presidential democracies, such as the United States, and there are coalition type democracies that we have in other countries, such as Israel. So we can look at the internal structure of the state, and that's going to be part of the explanation for the event we're trying to explain. So we can use different levels of analysis to study the same events. And that was mostly based on the discussion from the Singer paper. I ended that part of the discussion by mentioning Singer's mentions the individual level of analysis, leaders, and we're going to devote a lot more time to that. We'll devote a whole week talking about individual levels of analysis and the study of leaders. So those are overall our three general levels: the macro level, the international system; the micro level, which is the nation state, and we also have the individual level. And then I shifted to talk about the idea of this gap between the theories, the stuff that scholars produce, the research that we produce, and sometimes what policymakers want to see, what policymakers value more. I talked about this gap between a more sophisticated methodological research that a lot of the scholars are producing, which to policymakers in many cases is not very useful, because sometimes it's either too abstract or too general, or sometimes it's even too complicated to understand some of the analysis, and they would prefer a more focused area studies, more focused historical studies that's going to provide them with those cases and understanding of an event. And then I talked about potential ways, according to some of the research, that we can bridge that gap. Where do scholars can actually make a more viable and a larger contribution to policy making when it comes to foreign policy? If you have any questions about that topic, of course, you are more than welcome to email them to me. All right, so shifting gears, moving from the levels of analysis, today we will begin talking about some of the main theories of IR, and we will begin with the macro level of analysis, which is the international system. When we think about different theories in international relations, we should see those theories as the organizing frameworks that helps us to understand the knowledge. So we have a lot of knowledge about events that take place in the international system, and those theories serve the role of as organizing principle, organizing frameworks in order to use that knowledge and to understand events. All right, so the first theory that we are talking about is realism. I'll begin with the background, the development of the theory, some of its core principles, and also talk about some of its problems. The theory of realism emphasizes the enduring propensity of conflict between states. It's focused on explaining why conflict takes place between states and how is that usually something that's going to happen for the foreseeable future. It was one of the most dominant views during the Cold War, mostly because it provided a very simple yet very powerful explanation for some of the most common elements that we saw at that time. That was the war itself, the emergence of alliances, the fact that imperialism was still part of the war, just some of it was starting to, of course, withdraw from imperialism, the obstacles to cooperation. All those things were really prevalent during the Cold War, and that made the theory of realism, which provided an explanation to all those things, a very simple and powerful framework. The focus on the competition was consistent during the Cold War and mostly materialized, of course, with the US and the Soviet rivalry. And again, that made realism a very relevant and a very powerful explanation for that time. According to the realist theory, the international affairs are a struggle for power among states who are self-interest. So they are pursuing their own self-interest and they're struggling for power. The theory offers a generally pessimistic view about the prospect of eliminating conflict and eliminating war. So again, the theory provides explanation to why war persists for so long and why they're likely to persist. It's not always just direct war between two large countries. It can be different types of conflicts, but the foundations of the realist theory is telling us that war and conflicts are likely to be sustained for a long time. Realism was introduced by Hans Morgenthau in his book from the late 1940s. The theory is based on 6 core principles, which I will talk about in a few minutes. Some of those principles focus on describing realism as a theory of IR, as a theory to explain interactions in the international systems. Other principles focus more on the idea of the different causes for some of those interactions, and we'll get to that in a second. From a level of analysis perspective, realism is a structural system theory that it is based on a set of assumptions intended to simplify the interaction between actors in the international system. So there's a couple of assumptions for the realist theory, which I will talk to you about in a second. That's going to provide us a description of the international system based on that theoretical framework, realism, and that's going to help us understand why some of the interactions takes place in the international system between states. So it is, as I said, it's a structural theory rooted in the pursuit of power. Realism provides us an explanation for the existing international system, how the system is structured, and we're going to get to that in a second. And it also offers prediction about future interactions within the system. Okay, so that's a little bit of background on the theory of realism. Now let's start talking about the six principles, which are the foundations of that. First, the first principle suggests that politics are governed by objective law that are based on human nature. So actions that take place in politics are actually behavior based on human nature. A theory that is based on these kinds of law is a rational theory. So the actions of statesmen are objective actions. And the rational action in this case is when we should think about that as we can view ourselves also as those statesmen. And when we face foreign policy problems, we must ensure a rational decision process, which involves assessing the cost and benefits of potential options in order to address this foreign policy problem and selecting the most useful policy option, foreign policy option, considering all the circumstances. The classic view of realism, which is this version we're talking about here, believes that states, just like humans, have an innate desire to dominate others, and that leads to conflict. And again, that ties back to the first point that I mentioned, that politics, according to the realist theory, is based on objective laws that are based on human nature. So because also human natures have an innate desire to control others and to accumulate power, same thing happens within states, and that is going to lead to conflict in the international system. Okay, so this is just one principle that is intended to just provide like a general framework to think about the theory of realism. Let's talk about two other important principles. According to realism, the main driver of behavior in international politics is the concept of interest defined in terms of power. It is the link that we use to try and explain the actions of states and the facts that we know. We're trying to understand. We know that some events took place, some country invaded another country, and we're trying to explain that invasion decision. We do that by focusing first and foremost on arguing that states are pursuing their interest, and those interests, are defined in terms of power. According to the realist point of view, the search for power is a crucial aspect of the theory, mostly because it also distinguishes politics from other disciplines which define interest in other matters, right? So we can focus on explaining politics as the pursuit of interest, such as other kinds of explanation, but in this case, this is a pursuit of interest defined by pursuit of power. So states are pursuing power first and foremost. And that is actually one of the main assumptions of the theory. Statesmen think in terms of power. So leaders of countries are trying to accumulate as much power as possible, and history suggests that that is, in many cases, what really takes place. This is an important simplifying assumption, and that brings me back to one of the points that I had talked about last week. Why do we have those assumptions in order to simplify? They also allows us to make a general description of the scenario or of the situation we're facing. The assumption of statesmen are always pursuing power allow us to study the behavior of any nation in a systematic manner. So we don't have to focus just on the behavior of the United States or just to focus on the behavior of China. We can say that both China and the United States, when we're thinking about it from the standpoint of the realist theory, both of them are first and foremost pursuing to extend their power. This focus on power ensures consistent theory, which does not lend itself to elements such as ideology, motives, or moral qualities. So it doesn't matter if the United States and Brazil, for that matter, have different ideologies. According to realism, both of those states are first and foremost pursuing the expansion of their own power, so we can explain and we can compare the behavior of both of those countries. A related principle in that case is that interest is defined by power, is universally valid and objective, but it may have multiple meanings. So the power will cover all that's related to how men control other men, right? It can be both physical violence, and it can be the most subtle type of psychological one. So both of them are viewed as power in the framework of realism, and that's going to be one of the main incentive and the main thing that countries are pursuing. The pursuit of power is relevant for organized situations, in this case, democratic countries, which are also shaped by moral ends and have constitutional safeguards, but still, those democratic countries are organized situations which are pursuing power. But the pursuit of power is also relevant to uncontrolled force, which can be non-democratic, can be groups which are not necessarily democratic countries, for that matter. So power is the main driver for all the actors in the international system, the pursuit of power. Right, a few more complementing principle, which talks mostly about the moral considerations when we think about the pursuit of power and explaining international events. So political realism is aware of the moral significance that any kind of political action has. It is also aware there's a consistent tension between the morality of an action and the requirement for successful political action. So sometimes political action may be in tensions with having actually pursuing a moral action. So there may be problems with that, and political realism in that case is aware of that. According to realism, a universal moral principle cannot be applied to the actions of states in their abstract universal formulation, which means essentially that states cannot design their behavior based on the moral principles of individuals. So if some individuals view action as immoral, that cannot be the guide for the behavior of the state. The state has to operate beyond that or above that. And that relates on some level to another assumption we can link to the realist theory, which is the unitary actor assumption. You remember I talked about it last week when I talked about the levels of analysis and the construction of theory. One of the main assumptions of realism is the unitary actor. So it doesn't matter what happened within the state. It doesn't matter if different individuals within the states have different moral principles. What matters here is the behavior of the states, and we look at the state as one entity. Okay. Next principle that we have here is related to moral values. So according to political realism, the theory refuses to identify the moral aspiration of a particular nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. And those specific aspirations of nations cannot be the guide to the way that the system operates. And that's, again, relates. Some countries have their own moral aspirations that they're trying to pursue within the international system, but that's not what determines the behavior of states in the international system. What determines the behavior of states is is the system itself and the condition within the system. And that comes back to the fact that realism is a system theory which defines by itself how different actors will behave. Finally, Morgenthau, reminding you once again, that's the the scholar that introduced realism, argues that the difference between political realism and other schools of thought is a profound difference. The theory allows us to view the world in an autonomous way. It provides a very general view of the world. Just think about some of the principles I talked about, mostly the pursuit of power by any nation. It doesn't matter what's the ideology, what are the moral aspiration of that nation. It doesn't matter. According to realism, everybody pursue the expansion of power. So that allows us to have a very general view of the world. And we use that principle of pursuing our interest as defined in the pursuit of power as the main framework to judge behavior. Okay, so that's a lot of background on the theory and how exactly it is structured, which sometimes can be a little bit confusing, but let's talk about more practical aspects of it and how can we use that to understand some events in the international system. So the actions of states within the international system, according to political realism, is termed the balance of power. It is an essential stabilizing factor in a society of sovereign nations. So that's the global state systems. And it works first and foremost to preserve the stability without destroying the multiplicity of the elements comprising the system. So, and this point is an important point because it demonstrates some of the elements of realism as a structural theory, because realism recognizes that there are multiple actors within the systems. There are multiple nations, but at the same time, it still says that this balance of power, which is a general system kind of principle, this is the goal, and that's what leads actually the behavior of those states. So, how exactly does balance of power operate? Let's think about an example for a couple of countries A, B, and C, and that's going to provide us with the way to understand how exactly does there it is. How does it work? We'll think about countries A, B, and C. We know that the basic assumption of realism, and balance of power, of course, is part of realism, is that countries will compete for power, will pursue power and try to expand their own power as much as possible. Now, if country A now is in a decides it wants to expand its power and tries to gain control on another country, let's call it country C, country B will challenge country A and balance against it, right? And that balance will create a stable relations between country A and B. It will also safeguard the independence of country C against any pressure from either country A or country B. Essentially what happens here is one actor tries to expand its power, and another actor that wants to prevent that first actor from expanding its power will actually balance against it and will create a balanced system. This is the balance of power. Now, that's just an illustration of a balance of power, right? So one country tries to expand its own power, and then another country will balance against it. And how do countries actually go into this balancing act? What exactly does it mean? So there's two primary ways that countries implement their actions in order to balance against their rival. The first is an arms race. I gave you the example that country A is trying to expand its power, in this case, trying to take more control of country C, and country B will balance against it. So if we're focusing on the arms race method, so country B will increase its military power in order to either offset the increase in power or the potential increase in power of country A or surpass it. So an arms race between country A and country B in this case will lead to this balancing method. Another one, which is even more common in this kind of dynamic between countries, is the formation of alliances. So country B, nation B, will join other nations that operate against A's strategic objectives, and they will form an alliance. So country A will try to take control or try to expand its power. So country B and let's say country C will form an alliance together, and those two countries will balance against the expansion of power of country A, which will by itself also tries to find other countries which have shared strategic objectives with country A in order to balance, because now country A views the alliance between country B and C, and that might represent an expansion of power of those actors. So country A will also try to expand its own power by joining an alliance with country D, let's call it as an example. Right? So let's see. Alliances are an important part of the realist theory, as I said, so I want to talk a little bit more about that. Alliances are more likely to be formed when countries will see that kind of arrangement as practical. A strong nation may leave if it will feel secure enough in its own power, or if the commitment of the alliance are too costly compared to the benefits. So, for example, if the United States is part of an alliance, let's take NATO, for example, because that has been in the news over the last couple of years. The criticism from American presidents, it was very prevalent during former President Trump, but Obama also talked about that. the idea of how much does the United States provide to NATO and how much does it get back. So the idea behind this point that I'm mentioning here is that if the United States feels secure enough, it can leave NATO. If the United States feels that its commitment to the alliance are too costly and it does not get enough benefits out of it, then the United States has a rational pathway, or it's a rational decision by the United States to leave NATO for that matter. But that comes back into another point here, which the motivation for forming an alliance is to extend one's own power. And that comes back, again, let's go back to the example of NATO. The United States stays with, one of the main reasons the United States stays within NATO is because it allows the United States to extend its own power, to project power, to place bases in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Northern Europe, and places like that. In addition, the distribution of benefits within an alliance is likely to reflect the distribution of power within the alliance. And so if the United States is the most powerful states within the NATO alliances, it's going to get a lot of the benefits in terms of, again, the ability to project more power, the ability to sell military hardware to its alliance members. So that provides also monetary incentives for the United States. So for that matter, the United States also has a lot of benefits from NATO, and that's part of the explanation why, despite this criticism by several presidents in the past, the United States did not decide to withdraw from NATO or to reduce its commitment to that specific alliance. Okay, let's think about a couple of real-world examples that we can use the balance of power and the realist framework in order to understand them. So for Morgenthau, which presented realism, reminding you once again, the prime example for a realist, a balance of power system, which fits to the realist theory, is the system of multipolarity, which described the world before World War I, before 1914. That's mostly related to what took place in Europe. This is what's called a multipolar system because there were many countries that had their own attempts to pursue their own expansion of power, and each one of them was powerful enough in order to represent the polar. So there was the British, and there were the Germans, and there were the Russians. And I'll give you the example in a few minutes when we talk about comparing that theory to another theory, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But the global system, which is viewed as a multipolar system, so there's multiple powerful countries in the system before the beginning of the First World War, is an example for a balance of power system. According to Morgenthau, this kind of system is balanced, it is stable, because if one country tries to expand its power beyond what it already has, then other countries will balance against it. So if the British are trying to expand their own power at some point, so the Germans and the French, for that matter, will balance against it. And exactly the same thing if the French were going to try to do that. This is what Morgenthau views as a balance of power system, which is balanced and stable. Okay, the other type of example which we can think about real-world events and use the realist principles in order to understand them, it can also explain interaction between societal group, for example, when there are ethnic tensions between different groups. In an article from the late 1990s, Professor Posen noted that when there is when multi-ethnic states break up after a war, such as, for example, at the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of multi-ethnic states that broke up, especially in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union. That could trigger, according to that research, the same dynamic that realist has proposed, because what happens is that once those multi-ethnic states break up, there's a lot of separate rival ethnic groups that face an environment in which there's not one central authority. And that's may trigger intense fears between those rival groups and create them incentives to try to expand their own power and to be more aggressive in order to improve their relative position. One of the main risks in this case is when in those kinds of scenarios, when there are minorities in territories which are disputed territories between those rival groups, then there are risks that that some members of those groups will be tempted to engage in a preemptive cleansing of those minorities. As an example for that, the real world example for that is what took place in Yugoslavia following the Cold War, when Yugoslavia broke up to multiple ethnic groups, and that led to a large extent of violence in that area throughout the 1990s. Some of the more famous violence against minorities at the time, which in some level can be explained using this dynamics of realism, of groups looking for power when there's no one central authority, is a thing that took place in Bosnia in the early 1990s, and then took place in Kosovo and led to the conflicts in the Balkans in the 1990s. Okay, so this is the theory of realism, a system theory, which provides us a very general explanation to how states behave in the international system, mostly relies on the pursuit of power. It has a very simple appeal in that sense that it provides us this very simple explanation to why states will engage in some type of action. And it remains a central framework that many states use to explain international relations. One of the reasons for that is that states continue to pay attention to this concept of balance of power in reality and worry about the possibility that if this balance of power will be violated, we may face a major conflict. So, for example, we can think about that. This is maybe some of the incentives for why countries in Asia or some countries in Europe are very happy to preserve and possibly expand the presence of the American military forces in their regions, because that allows them to expand their own power and actually to balance again any kind of threat that they see from other countries. So that's just part of the way we can think about why realism is still relevant even today, almost 60 years after it was, 70 years after it was introduced for the first time. Okay. All right, so now we're moving to the theory of neorealism. The neorealist view of the world is, on some level, an advanced version of the classic nihilism. It was realism. It was introduced by Kenneth Waltz, a former professor at Harvard, in the late 1970s. The neorealist perspective adjusts the realist views by emphasizing that state behavior is contingent upon and mostly dependent upon the international system. So the realist perspective introduced that system level kind of explanation. So the international system determines the behavior of states. In the neorealist perspective, this is even more amplified. And we're going to see that in the next few minutes. The theory has 4 core assumptions, which I'm going to talk about in a few seconds. Those assumptions are intended mostly to clarify the role of the system as determining nations' behavior and not their internal affairs. So again, further emphasizing the importance of the international system as driving the behavior of states and not the internal affair of those states. According to Waltz, those assumptions and that focus and that overall description of neo-realist view as a structural theory represents a reasonable trade-off in terms of providing much more parsimony, so a much more simple explanation, even though on some level it comes at the expense of accuracy. So it's not the most accurate explanation to some of the events that takes place in the international system, but it's a lot more simple. Let's see what those assumptions are. Some of them you will be, on some level at least, familiar with. So let's see. First, one of the most important assumptions, which is also reflected in the realist theory, is the assumption of anarchy and self-help. There is no supranational authority that can enforce agreements between nation states. And for nation states, only their self-interest, only their self-help will prevail. What exactly does that mean? In the international system, we don't have one entity that can enforce any kind of agreements or any kind of interaction between states. If not in the international system, if I'm going to work somewhere and I'm signing a contract with my employer, If one of us, if I violate this contract or the employer, we can go to any kind of an arbitrary system, whether it is the courts or any other entity, and they will enforce the agreement or enforce any kind of solution. But in the international system, this kind of dynamic does not take place because there's no one to actually enforce it. If the United States and Canada, as an example, sign a peace treaty, only the United States and Canada can enforce that treaty. If one of those countries will violate the treaty, if Canada will violate the treaty, the United States cannot go to any other entity in the world and tell them, well, you have to help us enforce that treaty. It does not take place. So the world is described as an anarchy, and states have to rely on themselves in order to ensure their own survival, their own security. Similarly to the realism, the states are the primary actors in the international system. So that's an assumption which fits also with realism. And the third assumption here is where we deviate from realism. States will seek to maximize their own security. So again, reminding you again, according to the realist point of view, states will look to expand and to maximize their power. According to neorealism, states will try to maximize their security. And all other factors, all other motivations that states may have in their actions will be relevant, but only after security is ensured. So, and here the fourth assumption that we have here relates more directly to the difference between realism and neorealism. States will try to increase their own power, but only if it does not represent a security risk. So if any kind of action that is intended to expand its own power also represent a risk for that country, those kinds of actions will not be implemented. Right? So those are very simple assumptions. A lot of them are closely related to some of the assumptions that the realist point of view has. But here again, the main difference is the focus on security instead of expansion of power. So again, how does it work? The international system, according to the neorealist perspective, consists of a number of great powers. This is the focus of the theory. Those great powers are focusing first and foremost on ensuring their own survival, right? So they're focusing on security and not power in this case. The fact that the system is an anarchy compels each nation to rely on itself for ensuring that survival, right? So that's, again, this is a direct implications from the assumption themselves. In those kind of situations, weaker powers will balance against powerful nations and will not bandwagon them. So instead of weaker powers joining stronger powers in order to expand their own power, they will know that because the focus is on expanding their own security or ensuring their own survival, they will balance against stronger power. And what creates, and that leads eventually to a system structure which is not the balance of power or the multipolarity that Morgenthau has talked about. We have a bipolar world in which there's two polar centers in which countries are revolved around, and those two polars are balancing once against one another. We'll get to the example in a second. The earlier version of neorealism, when neorealism was relatively early in its years in the 1980s and early 1990s, was also called defensive realism. This school emphasizes that states are focusing mostly on survival and not expanding their power. And the way that states ensure their survival is by forming balancing alliances that rely on defensive postures. And because the theory was mostly related to events that took place in the international system during the Cold War, those defensive postures are seen as having retaliatory nuclear forces. So when we have one pole on the one side, which is the United States in that matter, relies on having nuclear forces that can retaliate against an attack, and the other pole on the other side was the Soviet Union. So both of them were relied on mostly defensive postures and not aggressive postures. And that's what explains the structure of the system. Now, a relevant theory for that focus on defense in the neorealist perspective is the offensive-defensive balance theory. According to that theory, when states emphasize the defensive stance of their actions rather than the offensive states of their action. There are less incentives to behave in an aggressive manner, and security is much more expanded. If we're focusing on forming defensive alliances and using defensive weapons, then there's no incentives for other countries to attack us because our defensive capabilities are very, very strong. And overall, that leads to a more secure system or secure international system overall. When states are focusing on those kinds of actions, it also makes it easier on some level to distinguish between defensive and offensive weapons, and therefore states can secure themselves without the emergence of the threat, which overall reduces the problem of the anarchy, right? So again, the focus of neorealism or defensive neorealism or defensive realism in that case is expanding is ensuring one's survival. States do that by joining those defensive alliances and relying on mostly defensive weapons. And when defensive weapons are the more prevalent type of weapons used, then there's less incentives for offensive behavior. A few more specific elements that neorealism has and how it is different or compared to the classic neorealism theory, the classic realist theory. Neorealism is described as a reductionist theory. It is a general framework of relations that places little value in specific details such as the internal dynamics of states. So again, as I said a few times over the last about 40 minutes, both realism and neorealism place a lot less emphasis on the internal dynamics, on the internal structures of states. But for the neorealist perspective, this is even more so. This is a reductionist theory which is primarily concerned with the structure itself. And one example to think about that is that while realism views states as billiard balls, so according to realism, reminding you again, the unitary actors, so all the states are the same, so we view the state, this is one way that is described, is to view states as billiard balls, and we explain their behaviors with their general incentives, which is the pursuit of power. According to the neorealist perspective, the view is even more general view. It's like a 40-feet type of view, and the structure itself has features that lead the states to behave in some manner. So the fact that the structure is based on an anarchy, that lead to that focus on security, and that leads to different types of actions, mostly defensive actions. That's one of the main differences between neorealism and realism in this case. The main distinction, again, with realism is the focus on security and not power. This view also suggests that states care a lot more about relative gains within the global competition, and just the accumulation of power is useless in this case. Because if I'm expanding my power by, let's call it by 5 units, and my rival also expands her power by 5 units, then both of us are essentially in the same thing, in the same place, and I didn't gain much. But if I'm able to maybe expand by power by 1, or not even expand by power at all, but I was able to expand my security, then from a relative standpoint, I became more secure, which means essentially I'm also more powerful. So relative power is a lot more important than just the accumulation of power. Similarly, there's an emphasis on prudent policy. So realism also emphasizes that idea. We're trying to behave. We're viewing the behavior of states as taking a prudent action in order to avoid war and to ensure security. This focus on security also means that cooperation as a long-term policy is not very likely, because any states can only trust itself to ensure its security. So I cannot necessarily trust other members of my alliance that I'll be able to stay secure. And that means in many cases the alliance can be short-lived, because states are constantly weighing the relative gains in those settings, and they're likely to desert those kinds of arrangements of alliances once their losses are too high. So if leaving an alliance means that a country will be more secure, okay, and that's where it's a little bit different than realism, then it's rational for that country to leave the alliance, right? All right. This is the most prevalent illustration of the neorealist perspective during the Cold War. So we have those two big countries. Each one of them has its own countries that join them, and those two poles, the American pole and the Russian pole, and that's why we have a bipolar system. According to Waltz and the neorealist perspective, the bipolar system is a lot more stable. Most states are organized in two large blocks. Each one of those blocks, just like I said, is led by a dominant power, and such a system contains very little uncertainty about behavior in the event of war, because there's two big countries that actually dominate what takes place, and that increases the predictability and the security and the stability of the system, especially compared to a multipolar world. When you have the multipolar world, the balance of power system, just like we talked about, that Morgenthau talked about, then you have France and you have Germany and you have the United States and you have Russia, and then each one of them can pursue its own interest and then may lead to unpredictability and instability. When you have just Russia and the United States as the two big power that actually dominate the system, then there's a lot more stability and predictability. Let's try and illustrate and think about how the bipolar system is viewed as more stable than the multipolar system. We can look at that by comparing the dynamics of interactions between states. First, let's look at the military commitments between states in Europe prior to the First World War in 1914. And this is, again, this is the multipolar system, the balance of power system, which is more relevant to the realist perspective. So this is the main military alliances that were relevant at the time. So as you can see, we have countries that were on one side. Russia had a defense pact with France, which had an agreement with Britain, but it also had an agreement with Italy, which has its own agreement with Austria-Hungary. And what we see here essentially in this kind of composition is there is a lot more interconnections between both sides and multiple countries. There's a lot more uncertainty, and that uncertainty was displayed when Russia and Hungary, which were on two different sides of those interactions, clashed over Serbia. That led to the assassination of the Archduke, and that eventually also led to the war in 2014. In 1914. So this is one type of structure that we had until 1914. And as you can see, this is how that looked. If we compare that to the international structure during the Cold War, which was the bipolar system, it is a lot more stable and predictable. Why? This is how that system looked like. This was the structure of the international system during most of the Cold War. So the United States, along with Germany, France, Britain, and all of other small countries in one defense pact, which is NATO on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the defense pact of the Warsaw Pact, led by Russia or the Soviet Union. And what we have here is there's no cross ties between the poles, and it's a lot more stable and predictable. And that increased the level of certainty, a type of actions that members of the system are going to take. Finally, let's use a few more ways to test those theories and compare them. So one way we can do that is look at the stability of the system and its longevity. So if we look at this from a historical standpoint, the multipolar structure held for much longer, from the days of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 all the way to the beginning of the First World War in 1914. The bipolar system was a lot shorter in that sense. It held from after the Second World War, 1945, all the way through the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. So in terms of the longevity of the system, the multipolar structure, the balance of power structure, which was introduced by the realist theory, is a lot stronger in this case. On the other hand, proponents of the neorealist theory, or those that support the bipolar explanation as the most stable and better explanation for the structure of the system, will suggest that even though the multipolar system held for much longer in terms of the number of years, it involved a lot more instability, and there was constant conflicts, even low-level conflicts, between its member And that led also to different changes and different configuration in the balance of power. So sometimes the Russians had an alliance with the British, and then the Russians had an alliance with the Austro-Hungary. So there's a lot less stability in this kind of a system. So that's those tensions between stability on the one hand, even though we have longevity on the other hand. Another way to think about that is to look at the number and the length of war between the main powers in those two systems, the multipolar system and the bipolar system. The bipolar system, which was shorter in time and took place after the Second World War throughout the Cold War, there was no direct war among the superpowers. The United States and Russia did not have a direct confrontation. The only example of a direct confrontation between major powers during the Cold War, when we have those bipolar system, is when the US and China clashed during the Korean War. So this is one benefit, that there's no direct clash between the superpowers. At the same time, there was multiple indirect conflicts that took place within proxy wars between those two superpowers. So between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was those proxy wars in the Middle East, there was proxy wars in East Asia, or in Eastern Europe, there's a lot of conflicts. So there were interactions and direct conflicts between the superpowers, but never it was American forces and Russian forces at that time. It was a proxy wars in the Middle East, East Asia, or in Eastern Europe for that matter. So there is wars between the major powers, even with that kind of a system. If we think about the multipolar system and the balance of power system, also there was no major war between the great powers of the time, Germany, France, and Russia, and the United Kingdom. And in most cases, there was relatively long periods of peace of 40 to 50 years. And according to, if we look at the international system based on that, based on those kinds of instances, then the bipolar system, which, as I said, had a lot more clashes between the different powers within the system, is not as stable as the neorealist will claim. So essentially what it says here, that the multipolar system, right, there was a lot of changes in the configuration of the balance of power, but at the same time, there were long periods of peace of 40 to 50 years, which 40 to 50 years, if we go back, was about the length of time that the bipolar system was held for. So what we have here is a lot of examples to talk about and to compare those two structures, which one of them is more stable. That really depends also on the assumptions that we make and the events that we're trying to analyze. Okay, with that, I am done for today with the introduction of the realist and the neorealist point of view. We'll talk about additional angles of the material theories on Wednesday's lectures. Reminding you one more time, you will get tonight the link to the first quiz related to the readings for next week. If you have any questions, office hours, email me, let me know if you have anything that I can help. With that, I am signing off for today, and I will see you all on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.